And Max is now at least 2 wins away from even catching up with the McLaren drivers, the leading McLaren driver, Oscar Piastri. And for him to catch them, not only has he got to score 2 wins, but he's got to score 2 wins with neither McLaren driver scoring points. And the odds of that happening now, as I said in the video, are very, very small. So it is over for sure. I think all that stuff, all that autograph signing stuff they do now is just enhancing the size of the brand and the whole portal that they've got now in this as part of their life, where they've got to be this other person. And some racing drivers obviously can handle it, but some of them it's to their detriment for sure. And John Alcon, in my opinion, before he starts talking about Freddie Vasseur, needs to answer the question publicly as to why Adrian Newey was not signed and how much of a role did he play in not signing Adrian Newey.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the F1 Hour with my friend and yours, the goatiest of all F1 journos to have ever goated, the one that they call Mr. Peter D. Windsor. How are you doing? Good, sir?
I'm very well, Cam. It's very hot here in Spain, but I'm in a nice air-conditioned studio. Hope you can't hear too much of the noise, but no, it's been a good weekend, a reasonably good Austrian Grand Prix, but much more importantly, two of my buddies on the golf tour, one in Europe, Callum Hill did really well, finished third, and then same thing with Chris Kirk over in America, in a playoff to win there. So he didn't win the tournament, but great to see those two guys doing so well.
Let's go. I think the Peter D. Windsor golf podcast, I think we'll all do it shortly. So surely.
Well, I always say that at the beginning just to annoy everybody. So they think, what's he talking about? Who are those guys? I could go on about the Acropolis Rally as well, but because Terry Neville didn't do very well, he did brilliantly. He was leading, but I think he had 4 punctures, a shock absorber failure, and an engine problem. Still finished 5th overall, I think, something like that. But I mean, what is going on? I think rally's the Acropolis Rally particularly is a bit over the top, isn't it? When, I don't know, I'm going to say, when punctures can play such a big role. But then I always remember, the 72 French Grand Prix when Chris Amon was leading by miles in the Matra, and there were stones everywhere. And this was the race in which one of the stones went up and obviously took the eye out of Helmut Marko. It was a terrible race for flint and stones everywhere. And Jackie eventually won it. And I remember Carlos Reutemann, who also got a puncture after that race. He was very amused by Jackie's sort of post-race comment in which he said something along the lines of, oh, well, you can drive between the stones if you get it absolutely right. And Carlos always used to say, oh, Jackie, you drive between the stones whenever he saw him. So, yeah, I'm sure that's what Sebastian Ogier is saying about Terry Neville right now. Oh, well, you drive like that, you get the puncture. But for me, you need to be going flat out in a rally. That's what it's all about, particularly on gravel, isn't it? We want to see them sliding and the car control. Anyway, there you go. That's my rant for the morning.
I love a bit of Peter D. Windsor rally talk. I really do. But shall we talk about F1?
Actually, no. Before we go, you're a policeman on political correctness. I think.
I don't know.
I was given a hard time on a live stream for actually imitating the accents of some of the people that I was imitating. Is that politically incorrect to do now? Am I not allowed to do that about Jackie Stewart now, for example?
There are levels of political correctness about which I do not know, Peter. It's gone. Honestly, it's gone political correctly. You could write a Bleak House length book on it, and you still might not cover all the points. It's.
Well, I only do this sometimes because Nigel Roebuck, my best buddy, is so good at it, and Matt Bishop for that matter, my other best buddy. I can have 2 best buddies, but I do anyway. And they're so good at it that I just think, well, I've got to keep practicing.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I've heard
Matt Bishop doing Ron Dennis is the funniest thing I've ever sat through lunch with. And it's even the gestures when he's not talking, a total Ron. It's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Anyway, sorry, I digress.
Matt, I've heard, if word on the F1 curve is something in which you can be invested, there's a brilliant Niki Lauda.
Yeah, well, he does a brilliant everything. He does a brilliant everything. Simon Taylor, Niki Lauda, Alan Prost, you name it. He can do it.
I love it.
But Roebuck's very good on Chris Amon, particularly.
One of
and not bad on Jean Barra as well, I think.
One of the best to ever pick up a pen in the name of F1. Go on then, Mr. Windsor. Let's fast forward to this weekend's Grand Prix. Out of the Austrian Grand Prix, round 11, what was the biggest story in your humble opinion?
Well, I'd like to say the infighting between the McLaren drivers, but for me, that wasn't really the race that I know we're going to have at some point, and we partially had in other events already, because Lando was on the pole, Lando won the start, Lando was leading. I mean, for Oscar actually to win that race, he had to do something totally outrageous and probably risking either car finishing. And so that was never going to happen. So for me, it was never going. There's no doubt that Lando was going to win that race unless he did something completely stupid or he had a mechanical problem. So that wasn't a race for me at all. Yeah, Oscar was kind of there or thereabouts, but that was about it. What you get a race between teammates when, for example, Lando's on the pole and Lando leads the first stint, and in the middle of the second stint, he has an issue with a back marker or something slightly out of his control, drops behind Piastri, but feels the race is his to win, and he wants to win it, and that's a race, you know. But when you've got the guy in front is the guy who's on the pole and it's an inter-team race, it's not really a race. All the TV commentators can get excited about it, but it was, to me, that was a Lando walkover from start to finish. So I'm not going to select that on this occasion. I'm actually going to select the weird feeling, the deflated feeling of a race without Max Verstappen and how it felt the minute you saw that car grinding to a halt and him stepping out of it. You thought, wow, this is a Grand Prix without Max. I haven't had one of those for a while, literally from lap one. And it was a bit, you know, it was a bit sort of hollow, I thought, the whole race. Even if Max had been just ahead of Russell, or I don't know, he might have been up there with Lewis probably. I think, you know, might have been between the Ferraris. I'm not sure he would have beaten Charles, but you can be sure there would have been some fireworks. This is Max Verstappen. And the minute that happened, it was kind of like, well, it's a bit boring, isn't it? And I'm not saying that from the point of view either of a Verstappen fan or a Verstappen non-fan. That's the right word. I'm just saying because, you know, that you get these people. Nigel Mansell was another. Ian Botham in cricket came back a long way. If you follow cricket, was another one as well. And you get these people. So long as they're around, you know, something's going to happen. And he wasn't around for that race. And so I thought that was a bit, you know, it was an interesting point. And if I think about anything, I suppose, and your leading question is always, you know, what do I take away? If I take away something that I will look back with 6 months hence, it'll be, well, it's a bit of a hollow race, that one, wasn't it? No Max.
Interesting you say that, Mr. Windsor, lest we wish to get accused of Max glazing and being too effusive in our praise of Max. I don't disagree with you, though. As soon as Max was out of the race, it felt like we were missing, that there was a missing link as far as the plot lines of the Austrian Grand Prix. He was there, and who else was going to keep the boys over at McLaren honest, if not Max Verstappen? So I concur with you. But I felt, Peter, like there was a crescendo of tension between Lando and Oscar. I wasn't sure. I know you were very confident in Lando, but conversely, I was convinced that Oscar was going to do that. You know, and I still think he probably should have done it. He had a big opportunity at turn 6 where he hesitated, and characteristically so for Oscar. And plus, he had the maneuver into turn 4 that he nearly went wrong. I think Oscar. I think Oscar on a different day, Oscar Piastri of the Miami Grand Prix, say, I think 9 times out of 10 gets that done. I think he was not poorer than we've seen him in recent weekends, Peter.
Yeah, well, I don't agree with that. I as I say, I think, you know, that Oscar knew that was a 1-2 for McLaren, assuming neither driver made any errors. And he was probably going to be second because Lando was on the pole and leading the race, made a good start. And then in order to beat him, and he may well have been pushing the car harder and going quicker lap for lap for most of the race. But in order to beat him, it's not the same thing as going slightly quicker, is it? In order to beat him, you've got to do something outrageous, which does put the 2 cars in jeopardy. And that around Austria, that was never going to happen because of the nature of the circuit and the shortness of the lap, and that was it. It was never going to happen, and so it didn't happen. And you know, they kept saying to Lando, well, he kept asking where Oscar was quicker, and they said, oh, the high speed stuff, which is, you know, translation, good news. It's the high speed stuff. You ain't ever going to pass it. All you got to do is be quick out of, I call it turn 2. I mean, we're getting confused with all these numbers, but forget about calling a kink a corner. If it's flat, it doesn't count for me. So turn 2, the tight right-hander at the top of the hill. so long as he was quick out of there, Oscar was never ever going to do anything. You could DRS him as he did, but then Lando was just going to get straight past him again. So it was not never an issue for me. And as I said before, if Oscar was on the pole and had missed the start and he was P2 at the end of lap 1, then you got a motor race. But not the way it was. There's no way Oscar, whether it's Oscar from Miami, Oscar from last year, Oscar from Melbourne, there's no way Oscar is going to is now at this stage of the championship, is going to risk taking his car or both cars out of the race just to win the Austrian Grand Prix when he can be second. Very, very good points on a day when Max Verstappen has got 0. There's no way he was ever going to do that. And I can tell you now, if you're Lando Norris and you are in the lead and you're trying to make sure that you're gentle with the car in all respects, with the tires, with the engine, the fuel, everything, the one thing you don't do is go super quickly on what they call the high-speed stuff. I'm still a bit confused about what the high-speed stuff is, because to my mind, there aren't any high-speed corners in Austria, but I suppose they mean that in relative terms. I suppose they mean coming out of what I would call turn 4, the downhill right-hander, into the next section, which is not really high speed, but I guess, it's not slow. So there you go. But there's no way Oscar was going to do anything there except use his tires a bit more than Lando. So it was absolutely correct for Lando there just to be on rails and just do what he did and focus on, his braking and keeping it on the island, which he did. And so end of story. Easy day for Lando Norris.
Yeah, he made it look easy in the end, Peter. But
it was easy. It was easy.
Yeah. I just doubted
it was easy for him. It would only have been difficult if it had a big issue. Yeah, he had that damage with the front wing, but everybody had damage in that race.
Yeah.
Of some sort or another.
I just thought. So go on. I thought Lando. I doubted Lando's ability to get a start, if not because of his. Okay, so he's been decent in 2025, but in 2024 gave up more places off the start than any other driver on the grid. So that was that was my first doubt as far as Lando. My second doubt, I think Oscar's just a better racing driver. I heard somebody say that. I think it was Tom Clarkson on F1 Nation, that Lando is a good driver as fast racing cars, but Oscar Piastri is just a better racing driver, and I think that's true. He's more forensic in his positioning. But turn 3, it seemed like Lando all of a sudden has learned from his mistakes of Christmas past last year, same race, and the DRS chicken between him and Max, and decided that he was going to give up the DRS or give up the position with a view to cross the DRS line second, take the DRS through turn 4 and just switch back and pass Oscar as if it was easy, which I think is new. That's a new wrinkle to Lando's game, is it not, Peter? I don't think we've seen that level of race IQ from Lando this year.
It all sounds a bit complicated to me. I'm not a fan of DRS, and I think the whole DRS thing is sadly made the race much more boring than it could have been. But the reality is you get passed into a hairpin like that. Let's call it a hairpin, turn 3, turn 2, whatever you want to call it. And if you're Lando and the guy in effect has had a toe and gone inside him, all you do is exactly what he did. You make sure you brake quite early and you just swing back inside and get the inside run into the next corner. It's no more complicated than that. That's exactly what happened. Okay, it was all enhanced by DRS, but people talking about the DRS lines and Lando using his brain a bit more with DRS, all he did was just a normal racing thing, let the guy run a bit wide because he's having to brake a bit later to go down the inside, and then just make sure you don't do the same and come back and get him. And he did. Yeah. Made life difficult for him. And I don't buy that at all. I think Lando's just as much a racing driver as Oscar Piastri. And I've said before, it's very easy for people on the outside to start saying Oscar Piastri's a racer, Lando's this or Lando's that. The reality is Oscar Piastri drives with the rear of the car. His feel is for the loaded rear. That is the moment in which he gets everything settled in his footwork and his handwork. And he's absolutely brilliant. And it's great to watch that. Lando is a different driver. He drives much more with the front of the car. He wants to feel the front. He doesn't shorten the corners as much as he's capable of doing. And he certainly wasn't doing it much in the race because he didn't want to play around with anything. But as I said in my Saturday video, in Austria, probably uniquely, on the entire calendar, particularly what I would call turn 4. I don't know, everybody probably calls it turn 6 by then or something, but the downhill right-hander, that lends itself, almost entices everybody to go in quite early and create a short corner. So all of a sudden, in a qualifying lap, Lando is in the sort of realm of territory normally occupied only by Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc in the way he's driving Austria. And that was why he was so quick in qualifying. And that is why, in my opinion, Oscar would not have got the pole, even if he'd done that last lap. Lando was driving almost a max lap in that qualifying lap. That's why it was such a mind-blowingly quick lap. So to dismiss Lando and say he's just a perfunctory racer or whatever it was, and Oscar's the real racing driver, is completely missing the point. And yeah, there are other psychological things with Lando, and maybe there are a few too many things still going on in his brain. And it's not a great look when you say help to the race engineer. But I think, the more I look at it, the more I think some of that is actually A, Lando's charm, and B, I think it's actually quite good theatre for his side of the garage. And there is a bit of a fight, not a fight. There's obviously a competition going on between those two sides of the garage. So underestimate Lando's ability to be a racing driver and use the front end of the car as well as he does at your peril.
Good shout, Mr. Windsor. I tell you what, I will see that and raise you this. I like the way you talk about the front end, and Lando's taught, or he's spoken at least to the point that he's that the 25 McLaren is very different as far as its handling dynamic. It has more understeer through the apex of a turn and gives him less feedback that he needs through the steering wheel. McLaren said that they've brought a couple of different things, upgrades at Austria to help him with that. There's bits and bobs of suspension, and now Lando all of a sudden is feeling he's able to drive the car on instinct more than he was previously. Oscar said in the press conference though that he just needs a fair shake. He doesn't want preferential treatment necessarily, but he just needs a fair shake. Have you heard of something like this, Peter, where a team has brought bits, upgrades to a car at the altar of one driver in particular's improvement? Have you heard of something similar going on like that previously?
Well, firstly, just going back to the other comment, of course Oscar would say that, wouldn't he? I don't know what inane journalist asked him, what do you think about that, Oscar? Because for sure, there's no way in the world Oscar would say in a press conference, well, I think it's terrible. They're building a car around Lando now, and it's really, really sucks. As if he's going to say that, even if he thinks it. So, of course, he's going to say, all I want is the equal car. All I want is a fair shake. So that doesn't mean anything at all. Secondly, I question the whole thing anyway, because the suspension upgrade was the rear of the car, not the front. It was the rear suspension geometry that McLaren changed for Austria, which, if anything, you would imagine would be to settle the rear more for the way Oscar drives on super quick corners of the type we're going to see at Silverstone. Now, maybe, there was some front fairings over the front suspension and maybe, I think, a mod over the scuttle, aero stuff. And maybe the rear suspension geometry's taken some of the load out of the front, out of the feel of the front of the rack or something. I don't know. Doesn't sound to me as if they're building anything around Lando Norris at all. And I keep repeating the point. The reason Lando is feeling understeer, in my opinion, is because although he's got a great touch and he's very soft and supple with his inputs, although he's doing that, he's not actually creating the short corner in the way Max or Charles Leclerc does. And that's why he's getting understeer. He's trying to do it, but the minute he tries to lean on the car, he's getting understeer. And that's why most racing drivers in the world don't drive the way Max and Charles Leclerc drives. That's why Max is as good as he is, because at that moment of the front going away, Max is very good at modulating the brake pedal pressure against the steering input. Whereas Lando isn't going into that sort of territory. Although, as I say, around Austria, there's that corner where he kind of does it without thinking. And that's why he was so quick. But I think around Silverstone, it'll be different. Oh. I think Lando will be quick. Obviously, he'd be quick. But I think Oscar will be very hard to beat around Silverstone. But around Austria, it's difficult for Oscar Piastri to beat Lando Norris. It's very, very good circuit for Lando for the reason I just described.
Oof. So, talk to me very quickly about Lando's mental fortitude, Peter, because a lot has been made of his ability not to be quick, because he has that in abundance, right? He's always been a very fast racing driver, but the question is about his ability to deliver in the times when he needs it most. A Monaco qualifying, good example. He nailed it. Australian Grand Prix this year, nailed it again. But it's been a campaign for Lando that's been littered with errors of the unforced variety. Lando spoke in an interview that he's now just focused on the process. He's dialed out of social media and just wants to continuously improve going forward. Are we turning a corner in Lando Norris as a F1 driver and a championship contender, do you think, Peter?
Well, as I've been saying and recommending over the last 12 months, he needs to get out of social media and stop being the Lando Norris brand and being the racing driver on his side of his garage, who's got a formidable competitor to beat called Oscar Piastri. And that's incredibly difficult to beat because Oscar's in an identical car. And so that's the only way he's going to beat him. As I've said, and we've had this discussion many times, just chatting between the two of us, the only way it's going to happen is if he focuses 100% on that to the expense of virtually everything else in his life. And whether he's doing that, I don't know. I don't like to see him smiling and doing interviews and those huge autograph sessions even. I'd love to see him, as I said before, building up a sort of war chest of fines that he's going to pay for not doing all these things and just be quiet, sitting in the motorhome and behind the dark windows and being Lando Norris racing driver and nothing else. I think all that stuff, all that autograph signing stuff they do now is just enhancing the size of the brand and the whole portal that they've got now and this as part of their life where they've got to be this other person. And some racing drivers obviously can handle it, but some of them it's to their detriment for sure. I don't think it is to Lando's in terms of his personality. I don't think he's thinking he's any greater than he is. He's just a very humble person, generally speaking. But I must say, watching him in Austria, I had a slightly different thought, which was that he is very insecure. And the chat with the race engineer was not really because he was worried about Oscar Piastri or his pace. He knew he had it covered. What he wants to hear is, "No, you're doing a good job. Just keep at it." That's all he wants to hear. And a lot of racing drivers don't need that. I can reel off a list of 20 drivers, all Grand Prix winners, who don't need that over the time I've been watching Formula One. But Lando does. And it's quite endearing in a way, isn't it? That he's always sort of questioning. I mean, it's a bit like you or me after a video. What do you think of that video? It was a nice video. Or what do you think of the book I just wrote? All you're really asking is, will you tell me it was great? And that's Lando's in that sort of little realm. And I hadn't realized that before. And I think that he is like that. And actually, I've given his race engineer quite a hard time ever since that absurd chat he had with him in the middle of the Hungarian Grand Prix last year. But I think actually he does quite a good job because he seems to be on the same wavelength as Lando, doesn't he? And there was a nice little throwaway, which was, Oscar's doing this, Oscar's doing that, but you just need to keep him out of DRS range in the closing laps. That's what you got to do, Lando. And it was like, no reply from Lando there. He knew that. And I like that. I kind of like that because it makes him different apart from anything else. He's not the sort of clone racing driver that they all aspire to be. He's Lando Norris and he does it well. And that's the reason he's got this sort of natural flair of touch that obviously some journalists, observers can't see, but he has got it and it's a wonderful thing.
That it's almost like a nurturing relationship that Will has with Lando, and I think that might serve him well. I tell you what, though, Peter, I wanted to ask you about this because what I hadn't seen from Lando previously was that the ability to do Kasparov level due diligence and learn from what had happened at, I don't know, an Austria in 2023 or 2022 when Carlos Sainz had an incident or an overtaking manoeuvre with Max Verstappen at turn 3. Going into the Austrian Grand Prix in 2024. And it feels like on the back of the interview that he conducted with Sky that Lando's now looking back, like he's going through the cheat sheets and the spark notes, the cliff notes even, and learning from the Austrian Grand Prix in 24 and understanding that you can weaponize DRS, and he's kind of using that to add texture to his trade. And I think that level of commitment is what he's been lacking, and it makes him a very dangerous championship contender in 25.
Yeah, as I said before, I think that's overcomplicating it. I think he's just a racing driver, and like all racing drivers, he learns from experience. And you learn, if a guy goes inside you into a tight corner, just brake early and come back inside him on the exit. There's no more complicated than that. Yeah. And whether he studied stuff or whether he just, over a period of time, he's realized that there's quite a lot to be gained by not braking late, then I think it's the latter, really. As I said before, I don't think he's a complicated racing driver in the sense that he analyzes things too much. I think he's quite humane and emotional. Human and emotional in the way he does it. And sometimes the emotion gets ahead of him. But generally speaking, he keeps things nice and simple, as Oscar does. Oscar's just like that as well. And I think those two guys probably would have been smiling a little bit inside their visors when that was going on. That's how I saw that race. It was very Bruce and Denny Can-Am. I don't think it was racing. It'll be racing, as I say. If Oscar's on the pole at Silverstone for the British Grand Prix, and he's slow off the line, and Lando's leading the Grand Prix, and all of a sudden Lando locks an inside front and he's got a flat spot, I can tell you now, Oscar Piastri will be aiming to pass him on the outside of Copse or the outside of the entry of Beckett's or wherever. He'll be the racing driver that everybody wants to see, and it'll be the race that everybody wants to see. But in the situation they're in Austria, no way Oscar was going to elevate that Grand Prix to anything more than it was. And he did it perfectly. He added a touch of, I'm here, don't forget about me. And there was quite a lot of chatter on the radio about when to come in or not, none of which seemed to work. And he was always there. He was a pressure, which is what, he needs to be, obviously. But he didn't take it to the point where it endangered either car or the team. And it was a perfectly judged race, in my opinion, by Oscar Piastri. As I said in my video, the only real mistake Lando made was to overcover the inside off the line and allow Leclerc to get blocked and allow Piastri, therefore, to be P2 in his mirrors coming out of turn 1, because that's the last thing Lando needed. But, he still won the race, didn't he? It would have been nice if he'd had Leclerc behind him for 3 or 4 laps instead of Oscar.
Go on then, Mr. Windsor. I see the human point about Lando, and I'll raise you this. You spoke about both of them and some of the great ones, a Bjorg, a Jack Nicklaus. I think hearing people that spent time with the greatest ones, that they would make mistakes, but they would never make the same mistake twice. And I think going back to Lando last year, I think that's what we saw from that characterised for me Lando's 2024, that he couldn't get good starts off the line, and he wasn't dialing in the appropriate amount of RPM, and he kept making the mistakes, almost making a habit out of making them. The Canadian Grand Prix, I remember they got to the cool down room straight afterwards, and George said, "Oh, that McLaren clash looks like Lewis and Button many years ago." And Max instantly looked at George and he said, "Yeah, 2011." And I think that's what separates them. That Max has that data bank, or the great ones, not even Max, has that data bank, meaning that they've minimised the probability of repeating the same mistake twice. Lando is doing that now. I think this is the variable change, that Lando now was aware of last year. He has the experience in the data bank of going head to head with Max, and applied that to 2025 in going against Oscar Piastri, and that I think is where, and I think you're right that that's awfully human and very endearing.
No, but I've also said he is learning from experience like everybody else. Even if he's thinking about it or not thinking about it, the experience is going through his bones. It's something that is there, and obviously that will be the case. But a lot of that is, a lot of that whole conversation is all about DRS, and that's that's to me is white noise. I just can't stand DRS. I think it's the plague of Formula One. I cannot stand it. I think it's just ridiculous. Anyway, and if you think about it, that DRS was a lot behind what happened in Canada, wasn't it? Because Lando had such a ridiculous speed differential going into the last chicane that it's like, what am I supposed to do here,
Yeah.
And we see that in Baku, we see that all over the place, and it's so unnecessary.
But Peter, you don't think there are any redeeming features in DRS at all? Would you just, if you had your way,
I'd get rid of it completely. Yeah, because these cars, in theory, they're supposed to be easier to follow anyway. And you don't. All DRS does is enhance a speed differential, which you can get anyway from a tow without DRS. And it takes away some of the skill of the drive. Well, it takes away a lot of the skill of the driving, and it nullifies the art of defense.
Yeah,
that's why I don't like it. Yeah. I think defense is just as critical and just as dramatic to watch as attack. And I don't really like all the sporting regulations we have that control defense either. I mean, there was and you can say, oh, well, there's stupid things going on with drivers, and you've got to stop them doing this, stop them doing that. Remember the days, and if you don't, you shouldn't be allowed to watch Formula One because it's all to do with the history of the sport. But if you think about the 1 litre Formula 3 cars that James Hunt used to race, 1600 actually in his era, Dave Walker, Bev Bond, Tony Trimmer, all really quick drivers. And they would be down the straight, they would be 3-4 abreast. But they'd get into a braking area and they'd all funnel in and basically do the right thing, basically. There would be the odd charge, but they basically were all very, very good racing drivers. And it's the same today. The more you control drivers and you put all these restrictions on them, the more some of them are going to try and get around them, and that's where it goes wrong. You can't control that race. If you can't drive like a racing driver, you shouldn't be in the sport anyway. That's my opinion. And yes, you have stupid things like Kimi Antonelli, but that's a totally different. That comes under the heading of lack of preparation. You were talking about experience with Lando Norris. What about the inexperience of Kimi Antonelli and what he was doing there? And there is an example of where they should have been looking at the past and what can happen at that corner, because it's a very heavy braking from high speed on an opening lap. If you haven't got the brake temperatures and tire temperatures up, the last thing you do is brake late or make sudden movements at the last minute.
Very well said, Mr. Windsor. Talk to me about that incident then and what happened shortly thereafter. You said that you felt that we were deprived of something of a climax in Max Verstappen's absence in the race. What do you think that means going forward for the championship? Helmut Marko said that he thinks it's game over as far as Max's Drivers' Championship. Do you concur?
Yeah, I said that in my video last night, because you can only look at the points on the basis of how many points you get for a win. And Max is now at least 2 wins away from even catching up with the McLaren drivers, the leading McLaren driver, Oscar Piastri. And for him to catch them, not only has he got to score 2 wins, but he's got to score 2 wins with neither McLaren driver scoring points. And the odds of that happening now, as I said in the video, are very, very small. So it is over for sure. And it is between those 2 guys now. And going back to the shunt, as I said, it's not so much the climax of what Max might have done in that race. The car wasn't very good, quite clearly. And Christian Horner said he would have done a 4-4 on that lap. I'm not convinced about that. He might have started P3, okay, but I don't think he would have been near. I don't think he would have beaten Charles Leclerc. I think the Red Bull's tyre deg would have been worse, and I think Charles would have got that. He might have beaten Lewis, probably. So, the Red Bull is not in good shape. All the upgrades don't seem to have produced very much. All the FIA flexi testing at the Spanish Grand Prix has changed nothing at all. And McLaren have got by far and away the best car going into the rest of the season. So it's going to be one of those 2 drivers for sure.
Wow. How damning is that we're talking about Red Bull as being done as far as the Drivers' Championship, and it's not even halfway through, Peter? That's got to... Max surely has got to be looking at pastures anew, potentially going into 2026 on the back of them not being able to, not necessarily the poor performance of the car, but their line of travel, that they haven't made any progress since Adrian Newey's gone to Aston Martin. It looks bad, right, Peter? Yeah,
new floor edges, a lot of new stuff on the Red Bull in Austria, and it didn't really seem to produce any improvement at all. And the litmus test really is the second driver, Yuki Tsunoda, and he was absolutely nowhere all weekend. And well, that's not true. He was actually reasonably good on Friday, but it was flattered to deceive, a bit like Lance Stroll. And so the car is difficult to drive, doesn't have anything like the same level of downforce as McLaren. You say it's an indictment of Red Bull. It's not so much an indictment of Red Bull, because no team can be brilliant forever. It's more how good McLaren are now and how great a job they've done in every aspect of the car. And with every improvement they make, the car seems to go quicker, which is unusual, really. So, Rob Marshall, Pete Prod, everybody there is doing an outstanding job. As for the future, as I've said before, I mean, the reality is that it's a completely new set of regulations for 2026. And so one or two teams, even outside the top 3 or 4, might magically get it right from day one, whether it be the power unit or the chassis. More the power unit. It's more of a power unit orientated formula, I think, than we've ever had before in the history of Formula One. We got this whole 50% electrification of the engine. So it could be that the Ford Red Bull powertrain project under Phil Prue is going to be unbelievably good, and the car not bad, which is enough for Max to win a championship. It could be that everything's terrible and he's got zero chance and he's going to have to change teams. It could be that some other team, whether it be Honda with Adrian Reynard at Aston Martin or Mercedes, get it absolutely right. Nobody knows. Nobody on the pit lane at the moment has any clue how it's going to be. And that's the problem. For Max, at least he knows Red Bull. He knows the people. He knows the team. He knows their good sides and their bad. But it's a big question mark as to what the car will be like in 2026. Equally, it's a question mark what the car will be like in 26 at Ferrari, Mercedes, and Aston Martin. The surest bet is Aston Martin, because Adrian knows the Honda people. Andy Cowell is one of the best runners of power unit development on the planet, and he's team principal, I think, or whatever he is, CIO. And so there's great people at Aston Martin. And if he wanted to have the least possible downside, he would go to Aston Martin. It pains me to say that, but I think he might. And, that would be it. Ferrari, it's hard to see them doing a power unit of that complication that will be as good as a Mercedes or a Honda. And what does that leave you?
Go on then, Mr. Windsor. If you were playing hypothetical F1 games, were you Max Verstappen's manager, switch Raymond Vermeulen for Peter D. Windsor? There is chat of a performance clause on 2 different fronts. In the first instance, if Max Verstappen isn't within the first 3 in the Drivers' Championship, then he can null and void his contract. And then similar thing on the Constructors. I think I want to say top 2, in the Drivers, and top 3 in the Constructors, as at the summer break, end of July. It's looking like neither one of those things will happen, and therefore they can null and void the contract. If Peter D. Windsor is Max Verstappen's manager, A, do you null and void the contract? And B, do you null and void the contract and go to Mercedes or go to Aston Martin?
Of the 2, you go to Aston Martin. You would try to get Adrian and Andy Cowell and Honda to leave Aston Martin and go to Red Bull, wouldn't you? Try and be with your mates and have a good time, because it would be so difficult having to live with all that Aston Martin stuff. But then again, it's not possible to do that, and he's going to have to go to Aston Martin. I don't see the upside at all for him to go to Mercedes, because he's got the same question mark after 26 as he has at Red Bull, and he's also got George Russell in the other car. So why would he do that? He might as well go to Aston Martin, have Lance Stroll in the other car. It's his team. He can do whatever he likes. He presumably get a massive amount of money out of Stroll Senior, and there you go. He'll have his pizzas with Adrian and be with the boys, and he'll be happy. I think it's a very good chance he'll do that now, because he's got that out and he'll do it. And if the Red Bull Ford turns out to be an unbelievable car, and Yuki Tsunoda's won 7 Grand Prix over the first 9 or something, you'll think, well, made the wrong decision there, but at least I got my bank account.
Oof. Go on then, Mr. Windsor. I'll see that and raise you this as a potential eventuality. George to Red Bull, Max to Mercedes. They promote Arvid Lindblad to the Racing Bulls car. Tsunoda retires from F1. And Hajar sits alongside George Russell at Red Bull as soon as 2026. Are you buying what I'm selling, Peter?
I'm a bit lost with it all, to be honest. Why would George to Red Bull, Max to Mercedes? What you're saying that Max is going to do that because Toto can afford to pay more than Lawrence Stroll? I find that hard to believe.
I think Toto, from all that Toto said, because there was a lot of chatter in the paddock over the weekend, Toto was quite openly flirting with Max Verstappen, talking about the ongoing negotiations. So too, George has said that he knows Mercedes want to be the best, so it only makes sense, therefore, that they'd want to sign the best driver. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, Max Verstappen. So it feels like they're confessing that this is something that's going, both Toto and George plus George doesn't even have a contract for next year, does he? Which I think is an abomination, Peter, being quite frank, that he's been so brilliant this year, like one of the drivers of the year, some say, and they haven't given him a contract yet, nor will they announce it because of the opportunity that is Max Verstappen. I think this is, maybe it doesn't happen, but I think it's a real thing that they're discussing in real time.
But if I repeat my point, though, I don't see how Toto would be able to pay Max more money than Lawrence Stroll. How would he be able to do that? He's going to have to go to the board of Mercedes, and he's going to have to go to all these sponsors and get. We're talking, huge money here. I've no idea what it is, but it'll be sort of 3 times more than Lewis is getting paid at Ferrari, I would imagine.
Big bucks.
And so Lawrence can presumably do that out of petty cash, whereas it's a much more corporately controlled situation at Mercedes, is it not? Plus, you've got Adrian Newey, plus Andy Cowell. Where's the downside in going to Aston? I don't see why he would go to Mercedes. I did say this about Carlos Sainz last year. When you were saying to me, "Oh, it looks like he's going to go to Williams," and I kept saying, "I can't imagine why he would go to Williams when he could go to Audi. Why would he do that?" And he did. So, I say the same thing now. Why would he go to Mercedes when he could go to Adrian Newey and Andy Cowell to make it, and probably have more money as well? It doesn't make any sense. The only thing that would be the decision maker was if he just couldn't stand working for the Strolls, I suppose. That would be that. And he'd like to, the whole Mercedes brand works for him for the rest of his life and becomes the greatest Mercedes brand ambassador of all time. That makes sense. Yes, I get that. But at the expense of not working with Adrian again and Honda and Andy Cowell, who he's never worked with, but he for sure knows about Andy Cowell. It's not even 6 of one, half a dozen of the other for me. It's like short term, I'd do a 3-year deal at Aston and then go to Mercedes, maybe something like that, if you wanted to have that long-term future. But if you wanted to minimize the downside for 26, which is a question mark year, Aston Martin is the team with the least downside because it's got the most known quantities in terms of personnel and manufacturer involvement. So that's the logical one. And in a way, I can understand Toto not re-signing George early because he would think a little bit like Ken Tyrrell with Jackie Stewart. Well, he's always going to drive for me, isn't he? He's always going to drive for Merck. We've done so much with him and he's done so much for us. We're just, we don't need a contract really. That's kind of what the situation is. Of course, from George's point of view, he needs to get out there in the marketplace and get his money up as well. But Red Bull, if they lost Max, I'm sure they would go very heavily for George Russell.
Wow.
But it was an interesting one. If George did stay at Merck and Max went to Aston Martin, who do you think Red Bull would get as the number one driver?
I have no idea, Peter. This is uncharted chat. I haven't even scenario analysed for that. I don't know. Maybe
it's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, is Charles Leclerc available?
That was my next question. With a view not to bury the lead, then Peter, there's been a lot of chatter out of Italy that Charles Leclerc's team aren't happy with Scuderia Ferrari and the way that they're being managed, the operational infrastructure or lack thereof. It feels like Frederick Vasseur, again, not dissimilar to George, signed a contract in 2022, and apparently there's not ongoing negotiations to extend that contract beyond the end of this year. Left the Austrian Grand Prix. Rumour is that it was family bereavement, personal matters.
Not again. Poor guy.
Yeah, 100%. But the pressure cooker, as far as the Italian media, we all know Scuderia Ferrari and how that works. The Tifosi, Gazzetta della Sera, and Corriere, like there is a coordinated attack on Frederick Vasseur now. And there's a sentiment that John Alcan wants somebody to supersede him. 2 questions then, Peter, on the back of that context.
Mm-hmm.
Should Charles Leclerc stay, or should he be throwing his hat into the Mercedes and Red Bull arena potentially? And if you are John Alcan, CEO Scuderia Ferrari, do you keep or sack Frederick Vasseur after 2025?
Well, as I said when we chatted about this last time, the damage is done. Freddie didn't sign Adrian Newey, and so Adrian Newey's not going to go to Ferrari. So the Ferrari that anybody inherits from Freddie Vasseur will be a Newey-less Ferrari, and they won't do much better than Fred. They might tidy up in a couple of areas. They might be worse in a couple of areas. So I don't see that now replacing Fred would be a useful thing to do. The moment to replace Fred would have been when he said, and didn't say, but he should have said to Alcon, if you don't give me the budget and the muscle to allow me to sign Adrian Newey, I'm out of here. That's what he should have said. And quite clearly he didn't. He caved in. And John Alcon, in my opinion, before he starts talking about Freddie Vasseur, needs to answer the question publicly as to why Adrian Newey was not signed and how much of a role did he play in not signing Adrian Newey, and how much did he change the focus at Ferrari by signing Lewis Hamilton instead, and how much did that detract from the work they should have been doing to get Adrian? And that may have been all Freddie Vasseur. I doubt it. I bet there was quite a lot of pressure from above him to get Lewis at all costs, and it kind of, as I say, distracted from what they should have been doing, which is signing Adrian. So there's a lot of buck passing there, it would appear, in my opinion. But what you didn't mention was Charles Leclerc to Red Bull or Aston Martin. Sorry, you didn't mention Charles Leclerc to Aston Martin. Now that for me would make a lot of sense. If I was Charles Leclerc's guy, which I think is Nicholas Todd, right? I'd be trying to get him in with Adrian Newey and Honda.
Wow.
That's what I'd be trying to do. A quick deal signed tomorrow just to make sure they keep the max factor under control. With all due respect to that great cosmetic brand. But yeah, imagine Charles in an Aston Martin, an Adrian Newey Aston Martin.
Blimey, Peter. This is going to be a very fun driver silly season.
And George Russell goes to Ferrari with Lewis. That'd be good fun.
Oh, my goodness.
But 2 buddies together again.
Yeah.
And Max stays at Red Bull. Or no, maybe Max goes to Merck. Yeah, Max goes to Merck. Still doesn't answer the question then. Who would drive for Red Bull?
I think if Max goes to Merck, you just do the switcheroo, right? George will go to Christian Horner. If past this prologue, Christian hasn't spoken the names of too many drivers, not by name, but I do remember at the end of Abu Dhabi last year, he was quite specific about, he said there are a lot of young, hungry lions, hot prospects in Formula One. Maybe we need to start having conversations with George Russell. That was the first time, that was the only time that I've heard him talk about somebody not named Max Verstappen. I think Christian would happily team up with George. It's almost like a swap deal in football.
Yeah, it makes I can see the two of them getting on very well. They speak in similar ways, don't they? They love giving weather forecasts and updates on track condition and so forth. They sound like BBC news readers, both of them, which is great. They'll get on well. But yeah, Red Bull are going to have to do a lot now to keep Max, really. Not so much Austria, although that was not good, obviously, in home ground. I mean, it's another interesting point, isn't it? What will this race have done for the ongoing commitment of Red Bull in terms of the amount of money they spend in Formula One with both their teams. I know the race is going to continue and the circuit and all that stuff, but massive amount of money still committed by Red Bull on into Formula One. And if they lose Max, and there's a potential for losing Max, how much in the post Dietrich Mateschitz era, how much hunger is there to continue in Formula One with, I don't know, Isaac Hadjar and Arvin Lindblad?
It's not the same, is it, Peter? It doesn't have the same cachet. Red Bull are completely different. It's a paradigm shift as far as the trajectory of Red Bull if they can't keep hold of Maximilian Verstappen. Yet the second that he leaves, I mean, you said earlier, Tsunoda-san, I mean, he's set a record now. Like, this is 3 consecutive races straight that he's not scored points. He was last, drop dead last yesterday of all the finishers.
And he was also torpedoing everybody out of the race, as far as I can see as well. What was that all about? I mean, he's completely lost everything. And it's all, when you read his remarks after the race, it's, I don't know what's going on. It's up to me. I got to dig deep. Well, you know, bottom line is he's obviously not thinking or understanding how Max drives the car, and he's never attempted to shorten his corners or to soften his inputs, because it's always worked for him in the past against whatever teammate he's had, and he's always been in half reasonable cars. But now he's in a bad car, it's showing up. But why didn't he do all the preparation? All the preparation work he talks about is not the stuff that he needs to be doing. Like most drivers, you know, same with Liam Lawson. Let's talk about Liam Lawson, if I may, because I think he was driver of the day. I think he drove superbly, mainly because, I mean, talk about pressure. This was much more pressure than Lando had from Oscar Piastri. To have Fernando Alonso in your mirrors like that throughout the race and to make no mistakes, I thought that was an outstanding drive. Really good race drive. Not surprised, because he's always been a very good race driver when he's qualified reasonably well. The problem, of course, obviously has been qualifying. He had the same problem as Yuki in the second A car, and then getting back to the B team, he's had problems with Isaac Hadjar, who's definitely shortens his corners and he's definitely does all the right things. But in Austria, as I said about Lando, it's almost as if the circuit takes away some of those issues, and he was suddenly on this one circuit. It all came together, and it's great. I doubt that'll continue going forward. I doubt he'll keep blowing Hadjar away, because Hadjar's got more finesse, but well, he drives with the front end of the car more. Finesse is the wrong word. He's just a shorter corner driver, and he's a more efficient driver as a result, which is why he's been doing so well. And there'll be fewer circuits now Austria's over where Liam's propensity to drive with the rear of the car and oversteer and wide turn in, all that stuff, the Carlos Sainz stuff. There'll be fewer circuits where that will actually work for him. But in Austria it did work, and having got the grid position, he then consolidated it and drove superbly, I thought.
He wasn't bad. But you make the point, Peter, that Liam Lawson, Alex Albon, Danny Rick, Carlos Sainz Jr., and now Tsunoda-san, they're not bad drivers, are they? They're not like, do you know what I mean? They're not rubbish. They've made it this far and they're good drivers. So is it not Red Bull that have some corn to hold? Don't we have to start pointing our culpability fingers at Red Bull, Pierre Vacher, Enrico Balbo for building a car that's just really, really difficult to drive?
Yeah, as we have, you and I have done that earlier in the show today, haven't we? We've said Red Bull have not done a very good job. The upgrades don't seem to be working either. Yeah. So yeah, it's a fact now, isn't it? They're not doing a very good job with the development of that car. And as I said in the last time we chatted, you know, I wonder whether Adrian is chuckling to himself every 5 minutes, saying, "Oh, you know, how much would they pay me to give them the upgrade that I had waiting in the wings, which they still haven't put on the car, because I never told them about it." I wonder whether there's something like that, some magic thing. It's you know, as I said, teams aren't going to keep winning forever, but it is unusual. Normally it's because they change tires or engines or something, or the regulations change or something happens. You know, that's Williams, McLaren, they all have good runs, Lotus, and then they go away. And it was because something changed fundamentally in the package. But nothing has changed fundamentally in the Red Bull package, and yet they've continued to decline over a long period of time now. And it's only on, you know, magic race wins like Suzuka that or Imola, where Max can overcome that, and be purely because he's such a good racing driver. they can't keep relying on Max for too much longer like that, because there are too many boring circuits out there with not enough Max Verstappen corners and too much DRS.
Oh, Mr.
So
Windsor.
yeah, that is the problem, and it's a strange one, really. It's a strange one. It's amazing how. I mean, obviously, a lot of the people at McLaren now are ex-Red Bull people, so I suppose there's no real surprise there.
No. Go on then, Mr. Windsor. Quick shout out to Gabriel Bortoleto, who some say was the driver of the day yesterday, chasing down his manager, Fernando Alonso. What is he now? Is he now can we say categorically that this dude is the real deal? That he's going to fulfill his potential one day in the not too distant future and become an F1 championship driver?
Well, I don't know about that. He's quite wide turn in. He's fairly. He's not as wide as Colapinto, that's for sure.
Ugh.
But I'd put him in the sort of Carlos Sainz area right now. Yeah, he drove really well. I think that was more of a Jonathan Wheatley day for me, because you had Nico Hulkenberg at the back of the grid finishing behind Bortoleto. I mean, that was a serious drive as well, wasn't it? Yeah. And again, it brings into question this whole business of Williams and Sainz Sainz, winner of the Mexican Grand Prix, deciding to go to Williams because it was a better car than Sauber. Talk about short-term view, when he could have been driving for Jonathan Wheatley, and he could be in that Bortoleto car, and he would have done the same job for sure. So that, to me, was what that was all about. I don't know. I'm slightly nervous about Bortoleto because he's managed by Fernando Alonso, and I know there's a lot going on behind the scenes there. It's a little bit like Seb Montoya now, isn't it? It's all that whole Fernando Alonso driver management thing. I don't know. It somehow makes me think of Flavio Briatore, and then it sends shivers down my spine. What's going on here? So I don't know. Of course, he's very good, and he seems like a great guy, and I'm very pleased for him. But above all, I would say Jonathan Wheatley, take a bow. And here's another example of a good person that Christian Horner allowed to leave.
It's all Christian's fault, Peter. It has to be.
Well, it's not his fault. I don't know. I really don't know the background to it all. But I think Jonathan needed more than just the role he was playing in order to stay at Red Bull. And I imagine Christian didn't want to relinquish any of that power or position to Jonathan, which is a mistake. You've got to be able to allow the talent to grow and to expand if you want to keep it. But yeah, I don't know. None of us know the ins and outs of that. But I'm very pleased for Jonathan because he's a good racing guy. He's old school, as Max likes to describe some circuits. He's old school because he's a pit lane guy that can lick his finger and see the direction of the wind and say, no, change this, change that. But what about Williams? What's going on at Williams?
So Jimmy V, as they call him these days, James Vowles, was coming for a lot of credit for kind of bringing that. It feels like they're making progress. But what's happened is that they've said, all right, at 2025, we're not going to win anything. So why don't we down tools, divest wholly out of 2025 and put all of our design philosophy eggs in 2026 now? And so I think that happened 2 races ago. So over the past couple of races, other teams are still developing and they're bringing upgrades. And all of a sudden, Carlos Sainz can't get off the grid and Alex Albon only completes a couple of laps. So it feels like their failure is at the altar of momentum or lack thereof over the past couple of races, which is sad, I think. I don't know.
It's sad to see the Williams name in that situation. I agree. But I don't understand this, Cameron. You're going to have to explain it to me, because aren't we in a budget cap era? And aren't teams like Williams, which are owned by massive banks, aren't they more than able to completely fill the brim in terms of cash available on the budget cap? So why are they in different financial situations to any other team? I don't get that at all.
I don't think it's financial resources, Peter.
What other resources would it be?
I think it's just human resource. I think they'll just have
that's financial. It's how many people
you're linked. But I think they'll want, as far as what they're focusing on, I don't think it's a bad decision either. If I put on my risk to reward calculation cap, yeah,
I think it's a terrible decision.
Really?
I can't imagine why you'd ever sacrifice reliability for anything.
Yeah,
It doesn't make any sense to me at all. And I don't get this apportioning of effort at all. All teams should be capable and are capable, regardless of who they are, whether they be Racing Bulls, Haas, whatever. They're quite capable of running a car and developing next year's car. And it's, I can understand maybe the limited amount of wind tunnel time and CAD time. You would say, no, we're not going to work on the new floor now. We need the CFD for the next 3 months. I can understand that, tiny little upgrades, but not fundamental things like sacrificing the reliability of the current race cars in order to have a slightly more efficient rear wing on the 26 car. Doesn't make any sense to me at all. It makes about as much sense as not taking a spare chassis to the Australian Grand Prix.
Put in those terms, Peter, you leave me with nothing. It's a difference.
And also, they've got two unbelievably quick racing drivers. Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz are really, really good racing drivers, both of them. And they're not getting the best from those two guys at all.
Yeah.
It's a waste. It's a waste of those two talents. And for Formula One, it's not good to see those two talents not being able to, display what they're capable of, particularly Carlos Sainz.
I agree with you. Jimmy V's definitely got some work to do. Although our old mate Carlos Sainz hasn't been, I thought he was going to, at the very least, be able to hang with Alex Albon, and he's been nowhere
well, as I said,
Peter.
But that it was his choice to go to Williams, and I don't understand why he did it. I guess he thought, a bit like Sebastian Vettel when he went to Ferrari with 4 world championships, that regardless of what the car was like, because of the might of Ferrari and because he was a 4 times champion, he would inevitably win more championships without having to worry about how well he drove and being self-critical. That's what I'm really getting at. And it's the same with Carlos Sainz. I think he just felt, oh, well, I'm a Grand Prix winner. For sure I'm going to blow Alex Albon away, without ever thinking about how quick Alex Albon is and how good he is. And it's just not good enough. You have to be realistic. And I question the advice he was getting at the time, because it was very clear that going alongside Alex Albon in a Williams was always going to be a problem for Carlos Sainz. In my mind, it was always going to be a problem. And the only drive he should have taken should have been alongside Nico Hülkenberg at Sauber. He could only have looked good. Every time the car went better than it had the previous year, it would have been all the credit to Carlos Sainz, and he would have had his 10-year, multi-trillion-dollar deal with Audi. Everything would have been perfect. Working with Jonathan Wheatley, blah, blah, blah. Instead of which he went to Williams and put himself in the, in this hellfire that is what we saw on the back of the car as they tried to push it off the grid, Terrible. I don't know what he was thinking.
Quite literally. Go on then, Peter, as you ran third base, super generous with your time as always. You ended your Austrian Grand Prix race review with a very sentimental touch point, and you're one of the few people in the space that speak to those who came before, speaking specifically, of course, to your friends Mark Monaghan and James Clark, Jim Clark, the legend that is. Could you recount some of those stories, Peter? Because I think it's, again, like you always say, it's important that we learn from those who have gone before, the great ones and the not so great, and kind of institute for those lessons going forward. And I think who better to do it than the legend Peter Windsor?
Well, thank you, Cameron. Yeah, I'm always slightly dubious about whether I should change the tone at the end of a video if I feel something needs to be said that is a different slant and from a different time, perhaps. But then I think, I owe it to them, really. Well, I don't. The sport owes it to them. That's how I think. And in the case of Mark Donoghue, he was always a hero because, the name is such a great name for a racing driver, isn't it? Mark Donoghue. And he looked so cool, even in his early Trans Am days. And then he was with Roger Penske, and everything was just like magic with Mark Donoghue. Even his first Grand Prix, when he finished third, I think, in the Canadian Grand Prix, 71, memory, in a Penske run McLaren. And then he did all that amazing stuff with Porsche, the Can-Am series, the 91730, which I think the Sonego car, which I think we all remember. And he was just absolutely larger than life in everything he did. And to me, he was an absolute hero. And then Penske announced he retired. And then Penske announced he was doing Formula One with Mark Donoghue, building a car in the south of England with Jeff Ferris, designer. And Mark was going to be racing the car. And wow, I couldn't believe it. So obviously in 75, I made it my business to get to know Mark. Well, get to know him, to meet him, get his autograph, first of all, which I did. I got him to sign his book, The Ultimate Excitement. We chatted about that. And then I used to go down to Bognor, where he was living near the factory, quite often. And we used to hang out at the pub and chat. And he's softly spoken, eloquent, articulate, passionate about motor racing. He confided that he didn't really want to be racing. He was happy in retirement, but Roger had really pushed him into doing it. And he felt the challenge was so interesting that he couldn't really say no. But he wasn't trying to be part of the Formula One elite. He was just Mark Donoghue, and he was wearing, jeans, fairly battered old Gucci loafers, V-neck pullover, T-shirt underneath, just a normal guy. And we'd talk about normal things. And I got to know him pretty well, I think. He bought a beautiful black 911 and drove that around in Europe. And I remember the 75 German Grand Prix. I was walking down the pit lane on Thursday, and he was going out to do a lap of the circuit in the 911, and he just stopped and said, "Hey, come and sit next to me." So I sat down in the 911, the black 911, did a lap of the Nürburgring with Mark, and we, and it was an amazing lap. It was a Porsche as well, and he's synonymous with Porsche anyway, obviously. And yeah, he was fabulous. Great racing driver. And it broke my heart when that accident happened on the Sunday morning. We used to have the Sunday morning warm-ups before a Grand Prix. And they're always quite early, 8 o'clock in the morning, something like that. A beautiful time to have Formula One cars running on a racetrack, particularly Cosworth DFVs and Ferrari flat 12s, because the smell of the fuel and the brake fluid and everything was crisp, and just, it was such a wonderful thing, that warm-up. But bad things used to happen in the warm-ups because they run full tanks ready for the first time that weekend. And some things would show up that didn't show up on the Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. And the Austrian Grand Prix that year, really, that summer, it was a big battle between Firestone and Goodyear. And they were going lighter and lighter with tires and reducing the plies in the tires. And and Goodyear were running 2-ply by then, as were Firestone. And Mark had a 2-ply Goodyear blow going into the very, very fast right-hander at the top of the hill in Austria, corner which doesn't exist anymore, and went off and hit the guardrail. But everything continued and everything ran as normal. And they were only about 20 minutes, those warm-ups anyway. And Emerson stopped to see if he was okay. And I remember he came back into the pit lane, and I remember he was chatting to Domingos Pedadi, his manager. And I sort of, I just went straight into the conversation, as you could in those days. And Emerson was saying, no, I've seen him. He's okay. He was sitting by the car. But, it was not good. The tire blew. We've got to be really careful about these tires. We've got to do something about it. And I didn't really think too much more of it after that. Obviously, he didn't race. And the race happened, and the rain came, and Vittorio Brambilla won, and taking his hands off the wheel as he crossed the line and crashed into the guardrail. It was, and I'd actually flown there in a light aircraft with Alan Henry, Barry Gill, and Michael T, taking off from Southend-on-Sea. And it was pouring with rain. And as I was sort of trying to get all my stuff together to get into the light aircraft, it's always the same phraseology. "Oh, have you heard about Mark Donoghue?" And I looked around and said, "No." They said, "Oh, apparently he died." I said, "What?" And sure enough, it's what we know now. He got a headache. And because the headache got worse and worse, they put him straight into a helicopter and flew him to Graz, which I think is about the worst thing you can do when you have a problem with the brain like that. And he died in the helicopter, I think. And I just heard it like that. And then it was no time to think, soaking wet into this light aircraft. which was taking off from the Zeltweg airstrip, the military one right by the track. And it was a twin prop Comanche. And as we took off, I mean, I was sobbing, obviously. I was soaking wet from tears and the rain, and I was still in my t-shirt. And as we took off into the night with the rain coming down, lightning everywhere, or just flashes, not fork lightning, just flashes in the clouds, I heard a Mayday call over the RT from Graham Hill. He's saying, "Mayday, Mayday! I need VFR and all this stuff." And that went away, and it got solved. You know what happened to Graham, and later on in the year, and we were sort of going up and jumping all over the sky. And I remember the fresh air vent of the aircraft was jammed open, and I was absolutely freezing. I was shaking like this. Mark had just been killed. I just heard about him dying. I was soaking wet, freezing cold, strapped in the back of this thing. It was jumping all over the Alps. And the young pilot who'd flown over, and Michael T had sat in the front, I think, was a sort of honorable co-pilot, passed a map round and said, "Can anybody see any mountains here higher than 15,000 feet or something? Because I don't have any radar and we need to make sure we're not going to hit a mountain." I thought, "That's great." And then one of the engines failed, and the thing went down like this, and the pilot was sort of, and eventually he obviously got the thing on one engine, and we eventually landed at Graz. I was just like, you want the day from that I will always remember and never. I remember when I landed, I remember thinking, if we ever land on ground, I ever touch the ground again, I'm going to put my hands into a toaster and turn it on, because that'll be nothing compared with what I've just experienced. And of course, that whole Mark thing never ever went away. And the tragedy, the waste, him coming back into racing when he didn't really want to do it. And there was a terrible lawsuit afterwards, I think, involving Bell Helmets and Goodyear, all of which was a terrible taint on the Donahue name. And I think, I may be wrong here, but I think because the lawsuit was carried out in Rhode Island, it was one of the few states in in America where the waiver law that said you waive the rights to claim if there's a failure, the waiver law didn't apply, and I think there was quite a large payment in the end to the estate. I don't know the details, and I may be wrong on that, so apologies if I am. So that was it. Mark gone, and I was just left to write an obituary in Autocar magazine, and motor racing carried on, and as it did. And because the car hadn't been brilliant, he'd started with the Penske, which wasn't good. They'd switched to the March, which was a little bit better. But because of that, it was, everybody just carried on. And there wasn't much of a big deal said about it, to be honest. That's what I remember. To me, it was heartbreaking, the whole thing. I just wish he'd never come back into Formula One.
Mr. Windsor, what better way to pay homage to Mark Neary Donahue Jr.? Do you know what I mean? Put some respect on his name, aka Captain Nice. Jeez.
I mean, he's one of the nicest people. Not that it means much in motor racing, because it's not how you judge people; it's what they do in a racing car. But he was. I mean, people said about Bortoleto, really good guy, nice guy. Kimi, really good guy. Max, he's such a great guy. Takes him out of the race. But most people are nice people in Formula One. And Mark was one of the best, though. There's no doubt about that. And he was gentle, he was kind, but he was brave, and he was strong, and he was brilliant in brain and with talent.
Wow.
Very, very rare human being.
Wow. And with that, Mr. Peter D. Windsor, you've been super generous as always.
Well, we didn't talk about Jim Clark, did we? We time to do that?
I think we need an episode entire to do Jim.
All right, we'll do another one.
I've been listening to Matt Bishop and Richard Williams on their podcast, Colossally, That's History, and they name check you more than a few times and talk about the baby blue Porsche that you bought. And we'll have to do an entire episode to Jim, I think, Peter, to give that the proper time and bandwidth it so deserves.
Indeed.
Peter, you're a legend as always. I'm super grateful for these conversations, your insight. Purple sectors is an understatement, sir. And if you, like me, believe Mr. Peter D. Windsor is the best in the business, the go-to-est one, then go over to his YouTube channel, eponymous YouTube channel and subscribe, like, follow, all of that gubbins. And shortly thereafter, get yourself over to your favourite podcasting platform, the Short Corners Podcast. Like, follow, 5 stars. You know the deal already. If you're watching this on our YouTubes, like, follow and share with an F1 fan friend. If you're listening on a podcast, 5 stars and follow. Between now and next time, as always, F1 brethren, remember to look but never stare.